Hello everyone, it's Oliver Reed. I'm here presenting my EPQ to you, my 5,000 word report on the question, are there advantages to homosexuality in the animal kingdom? So let's start off. So first of all, we're going to discuss why I chose this question in particular. So first of all, it was all down to a love of biology. As you can guess, this question is situated very deeply in all things biology, right in the middle of the animal kingdom. All about information I've never heard before, information I thought that most people probably hadn't heard before, and information I knew that was going to be incredibly interesting for me. And it all revolved around animals in nature and humans too. In the biological context. So that was one of the reasons. The second reason was because this report is based on fact and not opinion. And what I mean by that is, as I said before, we're looking at this in a very much a biological context. I was very adamant from the start this would not be me making any decisions on my own opinion about what I thought about homosexuality, whether it was morally okay, and specifically also not talking about if there were disadvantages to homosexuality. This was purely going to be about a biological aspect, all about the advantages of homosexuality. And finally, and kind of almost linked to that, is to clear misunderstanding. So the comparison that I've always made is that if I asked several of my peers and people around me a simple question, that was, why do people have different coloured skin? And anyone who was familiar with basic biology, the sort of thing that they would teach in school, and most of the people I asked could answer this, was that different coloured skins has everything to do with melanin and the amount of UV light that you're exposed to. All about pigmentation, and the more UV you're exposed to, the more pigmentation, the darker your skin. And so therefore it seems absurd to have any form of prejudice or discrimination against a person of different coloured skin based only purely on that biological fact of melanin and pigmentation. So I asked a similar question to the same people about homosexuality and asked, so why are different people of different sexual orientation? Why is one person heterosexual and one person homosexual? And no one that I asked could answer, because this question, there was a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of lack of knowledge. And I believe that lack of knowledge and fear of the unknown is a great factor in phobias. If we were to be able to clear up the ideas and facts behind why homosexuality exists and the advantages of it, then perhaps in clearing that misunderstanding, we can stop people from forming false views about homosexuality and therefore developing homophobic views. So before the essay begins, I want to talk about the ways that I had to find research. Now, an important part of this was entirely a new concept for me. Although, like I said before, I had a deep interest in biology, so knowing backgrounds into things like natural selection and reproduction were immensely great to me. But all of this research was incredibly new to me, and so it was important that I started straight off into my secondary research, finding names, finding articles, just somewhere that I could take a step into the water and figure out what the depth was. And luckily for me, there was depth. I split my essay into two sections, one for humans and one for animals, but like I said, purely in the biological context, not talking about society so much. For humans, I found two names, Kwasi Rahman and Paul Vasey. And for animals, Bruce Bagamill. Now, these were people that really knew what they were talking about. So these were people that I relied quite heavily on in giving me names, articles, and allowing me to specify my research further, just using these people as my first stepping stones. So they were very, very important. I should also mention that I did come across several difficulties with conducting primary research. One thing I did not want to do, I thought it was quite inappropriate if I was to take a collection of homosexual people and start to quiz them on why they're homosexual or why they think they're homosexual. Something like a questionnaire or a survey I already knew wouldn't be appropriate. So my only alternative was to try and gain interviews with professionals and experts like the ones previously mentioned. Unfortunately, I found it quite difficult to find ways to contact them and also gaining replies. primary research was something that I struggled with quite a lot for this research. But for upcoming projects in the future, it might be more of a viable option. But for this question in particular, unfortunately, I was not able to complete so much primary research. Nevertheless, that did not stop me. So to begin the essay topics then, we'll talk about kin selection. Now, this applied to both animals and humans. We'll talk about animals before we talk about humans though, but first we need to give it a definition. So kin selection. A strategy in nature in which a single organism might sacrifice its opportunity for reproductive success for the benefit of another's. And as it states in the title, we see this most common with kin. The reason being, if you imagine that an animal chooses or is unable to reproduce, then by helping its kin, potential organisms that can reproduce, just by nature, it's preserving its own genetic code, because as their kin, they share some DNA. And you can see why this might be beneficial. A great example of this is the working ant. So the working ant provides food, shelter, and defense for its queen. But in this whole process of evolution and this happening, the working ant has become completely sterile. However, if it does make those provisions, then the queen goes on to lay 300,000 eggs for its colony. Now we can see that in the process of the ant becoming sterile, we have an overall benefit of the queen mother producing all those eggs. So the benefit outweighs the cost. Now Bagamel, as mentioned before, he looked at daycare centres, identical to somewhat of what we have in our human societies, in which parents will drop off their offspring to a couple of caregivers and proceed to do their daily activities without their children. Now, this happened in nature. We have primates that will drop off their offspring into the care of several caregivers and will go on to do their daily activities. Now, birds, they have a system very, very similar to this. It's just called a different name, helper in the nest. And the reason why is because, as you might have made the link, birds, instead of leaving the nest, they will stay on even in adolescence and help their kin survive so that they can go on to reproduce successfully. Now, for birds, we see at least 222 species using this system, and yet homosexuality only occurs in 8 of them. So to put names to those figures, the pukeko and grey-capped social weavers, only the parents engage in homosexual activity, and for an additional 6, homosexuality occurs in both the parents and the caregivers. For the pied kingfisher, only a select group are same-sex intimate, and they are completely irrelevant to this system. So the theory goes, in order for kin selection to be an advantage for homosexuality, homosexual animals, specifically birds as we're talking in this context, they should be the ones most likely to be helpers, as that, if they cannot provide offspring, that is the way in which they will help their kind. However, we do not see this here. In fact, in no animal species is there a helping system in which helpers are exclusively homosexual. In all of the species that have been observed displaying some form of homosexuality, less than a third of these also have a helper system. So for animals, this doesn't seem like it's the right explanation. However, there's no research on animals to suggest that a homosexual helper is any worse than a heterosexual helper, and thus the possibility that homosexuality could be an advantage to its species in animals through kin selection may be, though not entirely, accepted. Let's talk briefly about humans then and what this means for us. The way in which a person might help its sibling to be reproductively successful is oftentimes quite indirect. What we mean by this is a sibling might not need to follow their sibling around, find them a mate, and ensure sexual reproduction. However, what a sibling might do is provide money, tutoring, housing, and provide stability. And in that way, their sibling is more likely to attract a mate. So as stated before, the theory goes that in order for this to be a good explanation, homosexuals should be more likely to be helpers than heterosexual people. So to figure this out is the Department of Psychology at Northwestern University. In their study, Is Male Homosexuality Maintained Via Kin Selection? So their method involved a sample of 57 heterosexual and 66 homosexual men. And both groups were approximately 70% Caucasian. So they completed a questionnaire from strongly disagree to strongly agree about several categories, for example, general affinity, which was the feeling of closeness to family, generosity, the evidence of provision, and avuncular tendencies, which is the theoretical willingness to provide resources. And it was found that there was no significant difference between how much money the men received from their siblings, but homosexual men actually gave significantly less amounts of money to their siblings than heterosexual men, which wholly contradicts our hypothesis that gay men should give more. Now, we should mention some flaws with the study. First of all, the homosexual men could have been providing things other than money, which would be quite significant that the study did not account for. But also, the study failed to retrieve information about every participant's income. So it would be suggested that a person with a higher income would provide more, and those with less do not have the choice nor opportunity to provide for their siblings. And this could be an extraneous variable that affects the data. Despite all of this, it does seem that kin selection is not a good argument for homosexuality and its advantages. However, we need to talk about the Fa'afafine. Translating to in the manner of woman, the Fa'afafine, though assigned male at birth, identify themselves as an androphilic, meaning attracted to men, third type of gender characterized by both male and female traits, and there are approximately 500 of them in Samoa. This is what they look like. So Paul Vasey, he did the study, an adaptive cognitive dissociation between willingness to help kin and non-kin in Samoan Fa'afafine. He found that the avuncular tendencies were much greater, meaning that they would aid their kin through resources such as finance and tutoring and childcare, compared to other Samoan heterosexual male and females. Therefore, this actually backs up our hypothesis that these third type of gendered people are more willing, perhaps due to their homosexuality, to give to their kin. Why the kin selection hypothesis only applies to this small group of people is not fully understood. But the suggestion goes that Samoan culture, unlike Western cultures, is composed largely of extended family and acceptance, while the Western world evolved into homophobia and discrimination. Therefore, a male-sex androphilic third gender group like this can exist and thrive. For kin selection as a whole, it is at least present in some parts of the world, and so we may indeed include kin selection as an advantage of homosexuality for the animal kingdom. Though there are stronger pieces of evidence that we can talk about, including advantaged parents for animals. Bagamill also talked about the concept of bisexual superiority, and we're going to relate that to the black swans. So what the black swans do is effectively they show signs of bisexual behaviour. In what they do is a black swan will mate with a female and then go back to join with a male and form a male pair. Alternatively, the black swan male pair might steal an egg from a heterosexual couple. But the reason why this happens is the black swans are excellent at acquiring territories, because collectively, with the addition of a male and the absence of a female, they are more aggressive, and they can acquire territories, and a good territory goes a long way for hatching and raising offspring. But also it was found that black swans, both males, were very good at incubating the egg. Now in a heterosexual pair, the black swan male will disregard the egg and let the female do all the work, all the incubating, but in a male pair this is not possible. So therefore both swans contribute very well to incubating the egg. Now the figures speak for themselves. Braithwaite in 1981 did a study and found that 80% of homosexual pairs were successful in raising their offspring, whereas only 30% of heterosexual pairs could raise theirs. Now to just back this up one more, we have Roy and Silo. They are two male chinstrap penguins living in the Sydney Sea Life enclosure. Now they are famous because they raised their own penguin together. Now, within the enclosure, Roy and Silo built the biggest nest compared to all the other heterosexual pairs. They were the only couple that hatched their egg in the whole of the colony. Now, the workers at the enclosure figured that the reason that Roy and Silo were successful was because a key factor for hatching eggs is noticing that the chick is trying to break out. And for many parents, this can take days, noticed immediately, and they could then start singing to it. Now, therefore, it goes to show that having two males to raise offspring tend to be more successful than a heterosexual pair, and therefore this is definitely an advantage of homosexuality. Finally, we're going to talk about the same-sex gene, and this was a piece of evidence from humans. So a piece of evidence brought forward was referred to as the superior heterozygous polymorphism idea. And the easiest way to explain this, and a common cited example, is talking about malaria resistance and sickle cell anemia. So the suggestion here goes that there are two alleles, one that codes for sickle cell anemia and another regular hemoglobin gene. If a person has two hemoglobin alleles, they are susceptible to malaria. If they receive one sickle cell allele and one hemoglobin allele, they become malaria resistant. However, if they receive two sickle cell alleles, they will succumb to sickle cell anemia. Now, the reason for this is the possible benefit of becoming malaria resistant, especially in countries where malaria is quite prominent. There is a massive benefit. This overrides the possible consequence of having sickle cell anemia. Now, the suggestion is homosexuality is very similar to this, in that there is a homosexual and a heterosexual gene. Now, if you were to have a homosexual and a heterosexual gene, the homosexual gene codes for some benefits. If you were to have two homosexual genes, however, you obviously become exclusively homosexual and cannot reproduce, but the benefit of having the advantages of the homosexual gene outweigh the consequence of being exclusively homosexual and not reproducing. So what we think is the homosexual gene codes for an enhanced sex drive. And in order to prove this was Sarah Nelson Glick et al. In their study comparing sexual behaviour between hetero and homosexuals. They found in their sample of men and women, heterosexuals aged 18 to 24 had a median lifetime number of sexual partners of 4, whereas for homosexuals it was 15. And in people aged 35 to 39, it was 10 to 67. And this clearly demonstrates a positive relationship between homosexuality and sex drive. And that could be because of the effect of the homosexual gene. Alternatively, we may be actually misinterpreting this gene, and in actuality, it was intended for women, because this gene could be X chromosome linked, of which women have 2 X chromosomes with men only 1. So therefore, if there was some sort of benefit that made women more attracted to men, and it was linked to the X chromosome, they would feel the majority of this effect. However, if men had too much of this gene, it would cause them to become attracted to men, and therefore become homosexual. Now, to prove this was Andrea Camperio-Chiani, who compares the fecundity, which is the capability of reproduction of female relatives of homosexuals, where we know the homosexual genes will be present, and heterosexual men. In his sample of 955 aunts and grandmothers of heterosexuals and 1,145 aunts and grandmothers of homosexuals, it was found that maternal aunts of homosexuals were significantly more fecund than those of heterosexuals, and the same was the case for the grandmothers. This therefore seems to show that it's likely that the homosexual genes have an affiliation with the X chromosome, and perhaps should be and could be conferring the most advantage to women and their attraction to men. Nevertheless, for men, it will code for homosexuality. So, what have I learnt from all of this research and putting this project together? Well, obviously, I've learnt a lot about homosexuality and its advantages. That would be going without saying, and that was my intention from the very start. But more importantly, I learnt a few bits that I'll keep with me. First of all, I learnt you must always fact check your resources. Going into this, I was quite naive in thinking everything would be quite as it seems. But in actuality, with all cases of writing, there will always be an agenda. There will always be a writer who has something to say or has an aim to what they're researching and producing, even with these EPQs. So I found it was important to make sure all of my studies had validity and that were fact-checked and based on real science. Secondly, I learnt to be open-minded. I came into this research with such a focus on proving my point. And as I went along, and as we talked about kin selection, it turned out that sometimes there isn't all the research that needs to be there to prove a theory. But that doesn't mean you should give up. I learnt to stay committed. Even when research didn't seem to be going my way, I kept researching, I kept looking. And in the end, I did find things that backed up my points, and I did find things that didn't. I put them together, and I proved an evaluative answer. And finally, I kept to my interests. At times when research was hard to find, especially for primary research, I remembered that I was doing this because I enjoyed doing this. It was a great interest of mine, and that's why I produced my report. And I produced it to a good quality because I was always interested and I always wanted to give it my all and produce the best report I could. Thank you all very, very much for listening.